So what we take up is conduct field research and policy research to proactively examine and expose the impact of laws and policies on tribal ethos regarding natural resources and their economics. It often happens that people at large think of tribals as a different planet or a disconnected world. People assume that we as citizens of India have nothing really to do with the tribes. हमें क्या फर्क पड़ता है? That remains a big question, and I wish to throw a little light on that. The stability and prosperity of tribal areas is crucial not just for tribes, but for India's economy and ecology both. Many major rivers, if you notice, are born in tribal areas. Many water bodies that cities survive on get their water from sources in tribal areas. These areas host the best forests, the global biodiversity hotspots. These areas contain mineral wealth, and almost all state borders are marked with such areas. The tribal population largely depends on primitive farming and gathering of forest produce for their livelihood. But it was only 12 years ago that the parliament recognized their livelihood rights. There has been an extreme backlog of development in terms of connectivity, infrastructure, and livelihood. This is a result of colonial laws and bureaucratic stranglehold of resources. Injustice perpetuates because of such systems. People are forced to take up violent means and are lured by extremists. Such extremism cannot be eliminated by mere imposition of state force. It needs better policies and administrative framework that can respond to people's aspirations. TIR exists to bring such policies. Currently, we are working closely with Government of Madhya Pradesh. Two of our directors are nominated as experts by governors of Gujarat and Maharashtra on Tribes Advisory Council. We are also working with Ministry of Tribal Affairs. And this lecture series is to bring a broad spectrum of complicated issues related to tribes in the political space of our gigantic democracy. So this is my opening statement and introduction of the. Now I take pleasure to introduce today's first speaker. Her name is Nima Pathak. She has studied. Namaste Nima ji, welcome to this program as our first speaker of the series. She has studied environmental science. She is a member of Kalpavruks, an environment action group based in Pune and Delhi. She has been coordinating the conservation and livelihoods program of Kalpavruks. She is part of the team monitoring implementation of conservation laws and policies, in particular the Wildlife Protection Act and the FRA. There is one nationwide network of learning and advocacy on community forest rights called CFRLA. She has been coordinating that activity for a long time. It has been 10 years since FRA was passed, and she has been at the helm of it. And she has also been part of a team coordinating participatory conservation governance in Bhimashankar Wildlife Sanctuary, which is close to Pune, divided between Pune and Nagar districts of Maharashtra. So when she is asked a question like "Tumhe mulche kutle," she would typically respond Pune or Hinjawadi or something like that. But right now she is in Uttarakhand at her parents' place, so she belongs to many parts of India. This is her formal introduction, and on a personal note, I would like to add कि नीमा जी में बहुत सहनशीलता बहुत है. As activists, we often come across bureaucrats and people who are in a way big heads, but a lot of patience is required to argue through, and Nima has a lot of such patience. She has documented community conserved areas all over the country. That number is more than 100 or 200 villages across the country. She will be talking about it in her lecture, and I was fortunate to visit some of these places along with her and to contribute a little bit in her studies. Thank you, Nima, for accepting our invitation. The stage is all yours. Please enlighten us.
Thank you, Milind, for that wonderful introduction, slightly exaggerated though, I must say. Thank you, Dr. Bhagwat and Anya also, and wonderful to hear about TEER and its objectives, I think very much needed in these times. So yeah, I would like to start my presentation. Can I just share my screen? So, pleasure to be here, and thank you all for attending the talk today. So, how our conversation today will go is I'll present quickly the present global biodiversity conservation status and its context. Then we will talk about the context and impacts of the current bureaucratic policies and practices for biodiversity conservation. Then we will speak about the context and concept of indigenous peoples and local communities conserved areas, or what are also called as community conserved areas, CCAs or ICCAs, in India as a way towards democratic conservation governance. We will briefly touch upon Forest Rights Act. I will not talk about it much because I believe there's already a lecture on it and you will be hearing about it in greater detail later on. But why we talk about it today is because it has a very significant overlap and interface with conservation models that one thinks would be sustainable for future. And then finally, we will end with what has been the impact of democratic laws like the Forest Rights Act on conservation and policies and practices in our country. So before we move ahead, I would like to take you back a little bit. I know that it's kind of difficult to imagine that there was a time before COVID and the kind of sufferings that people have gone through, panic and fear that people have gone through in last year and a half, is unprecedented. But if we recall a little bit before 2019, there were a few things happening which were as panic creating and as disastrous, indicating the future, a culmination of which actually is COVID. There were massive forest fires, if you all remember those times, across the globe in areas where there have been never fires, including the North Pole. There have been floods and hurricanes. And very interestingly, a research was carried out by a large number of scientists, common people, and government agencies as part of a UN Global Biodiversity Status Report by a body called the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. What this report brought out actually should be something that really makes us sit up, because it revealed such a large number of people collectively came up and revealed that more than 1 million species currently stand threatened as we speak right now. Over 40% of our amphibian population is under threat. Threat of extinction, it's not even just threat, but of threat of extinction. 33% corals, 33% marine mammals. Many of these are species that we may not even have seen very well or known very well yet. 680 vertebrate species extinct since 16th century. Over 9% of domestic breeds of mammals used for food and agriculture are extinct, and more than 1,000 breeds are threatened. And 33% land environment and 66% marine environment is significantly altered by humans right now, which means that it is almost at a stage where it cannot be reversed. And very interestingly, it has severe, it's not just environmental or species decline that we are talking about, but it has very serious implications for human beings. In addition to COVID-like situations that we are already facing, which is loss of pollinating species have put on risk annual global crop production worth about $577 billion. This is what the report says. About 100 to 300 million people are at a risk of floods and hurricanes because of loss of coastal habitats. And the report also says that many of our practices are actually unsustainable, including our fish harvest, 93% of which was already unsustainable in 2015. So if we look at If we look at the figures for India, unfortunately, as of now, we don't have very detailed data which is going on because IPBES is continuing its research. But we still know that we have many species on the verge of extinction even in India. In fact, in places like the northeast of India, there are species which are not even known but already threatened by a number of development projects as the forests come under threat. So we know that 6% of wild plants and animals are threatened. 2 mammals, 3 birds, and 15 to 20 plants we knew were extinct already in the 1990s. And 2/3 of the species could become extinct in 50 years, next 50 years. This is what is being estimated. And most of the indigenous agricultural diversity, as we all know, the kind of food that we used to eat just a couple of generations back, the kind of livestock we used to have is already disappearing or disappeared. If we look at the habitat, it's really alarming. Yes.
Nimaji, can I?
Yes.
I'm very sorry to interrupt you or disturb you, but I think the first your PPT has not moved beyond first slide, ma'am. That's what we are getting the messages. So could you please move to or refresh or because your PPT next slides are not being seen. Only the
Nima,
first
this is Gurudas here. I think you have shared the wrong screen. You need to share the screen which is your slideshow.
Yeah,
And
now we can see. Now we can.
is also very low.
No, hello.
Yes, Nimaji, now we can see the next slide, the presentation.
So yeah, what I was doing was I was using the slideshow to move, but I moved back to the non-slideshow screen. So I'll use this.
No issues. This can be read, so you can use this and continue. Thank you.
Sure. Oh, sure. So I was just talking about this slide. Then we already spoke about. Can you see the slide now?
Yes, we can see the slide.
Yes, we can see.
So I was talking about the kind of habitat loss that we've had. More than 50% of forests have disappeared in last 200 years. 70% of water bodies are polluted and drained out. 40% mangroves are destroyed. And the rate of disappearance of species is highest, unprecedented. So the question then comes is it because we are lacking in our conservation practice? Is there something missing at that end? But if we look at it, we realize that 21% of our total land mass, which is over 70 million hectares, is described as forest. Talking about only forest ecosystems, I'm not even addressing other ecosystems right now. And under the control of the Forest Department, under government agencies, and subject to some of the most stringent laws, globally speaking, including the Wildlife Protection Act, the Forest Conservation Act, Biodiversity Act, and Indian Forest Act, and there are many others. If we look at the Convention on Biological Diversity, they had set out a target and they had said that to be able to have a healthy population of biodiversity, we should have at least 11% of terrestrial area under conservation. This, of course, is being contested now, and there are figures which we will speak about later on. But if we compare it with what we have, it already seems like we have quite a lot of forest ecosystem under some kind of conservation governance. If we look at protected areas, we have about over 800 protected areas covering 5% of India's geographical area, including tiger reserves, national parks, and wildlife sanctuaries. And in fact, their numbers, even though the total area under these protected areas has not significantly increased, but their numbers have significantly increased from 67 in 1988 to 870 by 2020. And we all realize that these protected areas have been critical for reviving some of our disappearing species. But one of the things which is underappreciated and not recognized is the fact that these are also homes to many communities. 3 to 4 million people are estimated to be living inside these protected areas. Unfortunately, since we are talking to academics here, there is very scant data about exact number of people inside protected areas, which also creates a lot of problems as we would see at the policy level. But estimates show that 3 to 4 million people are inside protected areas and many more million are on the surrounding fringe areas, and all of them are critically dependent on the resources found inside these protected areas or around these protected areas for economic, ecological, and cultural reasons. But the conventional approach that we've had to for conservation of the biodiversity in these areas has been very top-down, has been protected area centric, where there are these very strict laws which are largely operated by state agencies like the Forest Department. And the people, these millions of people who live inside and outside, have more or less no say in how whether these protected areas should be declared or not, when they should be declared, what happens to their rights, where do they go after these protected areas are declared. None of it they have much of a say. And we all realize that it is because we are a colonial, a country which is coming from a colonial history. Most of our laws, if we look at, are either from the British times or are based, or their roots still lie in the perceptions or the conceptions that British had about looking at a society. So British had a very distrustful relationship with the natives, as they call them. We continue that distrust even today after 70 years of independence. The coexistence, the fact that people could live in environments which are wild, where other species live, not necessarily in a romantic, rosy picture of drinking from the same water source, but coexisting with each other. That concept was alien to British. At the same time, British had very strong commercial interest, for which they took over a lot of common lands and made them either state forest or, for revenue generation, privatized them. So a very common property resource system turned into an individual form of a society. This meant, of course, that there was a fundamental shift and change in the way people related with their environment around them. Instead of a system of reciprocation, it was a system of theft, a system of illegality set in. So you became a criminal overnight in the lands that you have been traditionally living. Denial of customary rights to inhabit, use, access, and interact with surrounding ecosystem was a very premise of many of the forest and conservation laws, which continue to be. Which also meant that people who've been living in their own lands became encroachers, because their rights were either not recorded in the government records, or if they were recorded, they were under-recorded. Like there were just few rights were recorded, a whole lot of uses and interactions with forest and ecosystem were not recorded. Occupying many of the people who post-independence also have been displaced. I think after this talk you will be hearing more about it, have been displaced from various development projects, when were not rehabilitated effectively, went and occupied spaces and became encroachers without any option. The resources on which people depended, like the non-timber forest produce, which were major source, or which have become major source of cash income for many tribal communities, rights over these resources were denied, so their collection became a constant source of conflict and oppression. Simple everyday living rights like grazing, whether of settled communities or pastoralist communities, were restricted and banned. And we all know, because we gain benefit from the traditional knowledge of local people. We either use medicines, Ayurvedic products, or a number of other things. So we used the traditional knowledge and appropriated it, but the access of the local communities to these resources, which sort of leads to evolution and generation of this knowledge, was denied. And the knowledge itself was never protected, because very few of them actually benefited from the knowledge that they held. Others benefited more. And the most importantly, they had absolutely no right over the surroundings where they were staying from external threats. So a mine or a dam or any other project, urbanization, cities like ours, spread into these areas, and people had no say into that about it. So obviously, our conservation policies are built into quite a few unjust practices, leading to, and in many ways, protected areas which are created for conservation have come to be synonymous with relocation, particularly for certain species. I mean, I'll quickly skip these slides. We can talk about it in detail later on. Particularly when it comes to tigers. when we have 50 tiger reserves in our country, and if we look at the figures, we see that nearly 3,000 villages that are inside what we call the critical tiger habitats. We can discuss it later. From them, of these 3,000, from within these 3,000 villages, 14,000 families have already been relocated or evicted, and about over 40,000 are currently being relocated. Most of these evictions have been without following the due process, which is appropriate process of seeking consent, providing the alternatives, ensuring that people are safe and happy where they have been relocated. So the general assumption is that tigers and people just cannot coexist. No exploration of possibilities of coexistence has been carried out in any of these areas. So we don't even know, but it is definitely an assumption. So what we also notice that in many of the areas where people resist these sort of atrocities and conflicts, there is an increased militarization. So instead of moving to a more democratic way of conversation, dialogue, we seem to be moving towards guns and guards, stronger and stronger. And we see this is happening in many protected areas where special tiger protection forces are being created, which is almost like a military in protected areas to protect these national parks or wildlife sanctuaries or tiger reserves. There is reports of increased torture. I'm sure you may be hearing about that in the papers, lathi charges, false charges, allegations of being Maoists or terrorists or whatever. And then in many of the protected areas, we also hear of people being killed in these conflicts. So it's almost, sometimes it feels like protected areas are almost equal to war zones and local people are equal to terrorists. So this is quite disturbing, and if we have been at Kalpavriksha documenting some of these conflicts, and we realize that almost all protected area sites are ridden with these conflicts. There is an atlas, you can see the link down here, which is Environmental Justice Atlas in collaboration with Kalpavriksha. This map is being completely, continuously being updated. Some of you may want to take a look at it. So the point is that the people who live closest to these areas, who should be the strongest allies of conservation, are being turned against it, because everything to do with conservation is against people. Or so it appears to them. So if we look at the Convention on Biological Diversity, there are currently discussions going on globally that whatever we are doing with our world, and it is evident by the impact that we are facing, is not really the right way to go. And we have to transform the way we are living, the way we are being. And there is a target which has been set aside in the post-2020 biodiversity framework being currently discussed by a Convention on Biological Diversity, which says that by 2030, we should have at least 30% areas which are under protected area or are protected as other effective area-based conservation measures. We can talk about this term later on. So if one begins to think that if 5% of the area can be ridden with so much conflict, almost like creating war zones and employing military to protect this a small population of tigers, then what would happen if 30% of an area was to be protected in this manner? So this is one scenario. On the other hand, if we look at the area outside of protected areas, that is even more disturbing. And I'm sure many of you have received WhatsApp messages and are following and signing on Bakswa forest in Madhya Pradesh, which is being diverted for diamond mining. And this is the same area where a few months ago during COVID times, the court had actually fined a farmer who felled 2 trees and charged him a fine of 1 crore, saying that you are depleting the source which provides us oxygen when people are struggling for oxygen. Whereas for the diversion of this forest, we are actually felling lakhs of trees. So if you look at the figures from 2019, 30 years before 2019, when this slide was put together, about 14 lakh hectares of forest was already diverted. Since 1980s, for mining alone, 2 lakh hectares of biodiversity and culturally rich forest area had been diverted, and 5 years prior to 2019, 86,000 hectares had been diverted. And in a parliamentary question, there was a response by the Environment Minister who said that 25,000 hectares per year is being diverted for various development projects. And this is in addition to 200 ports and almost all major rivers and multiple dams that we will hear about. And this is not just, this is the scenario outside the protected areas, but even protected areas are not spared. That as we talk, Banpathera in Rajasthan is being denoted because sandstone has to be extracted from this protected area. So it was first created by denying the rights of the local people in 1985, and now when we need sandstone from the area, it is being denotified. This is despite strong opposition from the local people in almost all areas. So it's not surprising, therefore, that UNEP study said that globally, although the protected area coverage is going up, and it was in 2012 at 13% of the world's land area, the biodiversity is actually declining at all levels. So we see that there is actually not a direct correlation between increasing the area under so-called protected areas and conservation of biodiversity. And the report also goes on to say that 51% of the sites identified critically important for some endangered species and 49% of important bird areas are actually still outside protected areas. So that's where the rationale of bringing 30% area under protection comes about. So now if we look at globally, last year there was a biodiversity, United Nations meet on biodiversity because COVID really scared people at all levels. And the UN Secretary made an announcement saying that with our current investment and efforts, we have only been able to reverse the decline of 4 species since 1993. Since this is as opposed to 1 million which are under threat, and since 1950s, 2/3 of the global wild population has declined. This is WWF Living Planet report. And most conservation goals set up to be achieved by 2020 have not been achieved. This is what the UN Secretary General is saying. So the question is, why? So we realize, we see from these presentation, you would agree with me that it doesn't appear that it's an ecological question. It's a political question, a battle of competing needs and aspirations and supremacy of powerful voices. So the Adivasis and the local communities who live in and around these areas are actually very weak voices. These are also a clash of competing worldviews. There is one worldview which sees humans as part of nature, whereas there's another worldview which sees nature as a competitor, because we always talk about development versus wildlife conservation as if wildlife conservation is a competitor for humans, and it's not really the basis of our survival. This dualistic worldview, seeing humans separate from nature, therefore separate these islands which we call protected areas. More like, for us, they are more like commodities to go to for retreats or maybe for a holiday, and you know, a place where some wild animals can live in peace. They are not really part of our lives. So human economic, political, social needs and life separated from biodiversity conservation is how we view our society, which is very different from the traditional ethos of the Adivasi communities and many local cultures, even our old cultures. So this is a factor which has very clearly been identified by the IPBES global assessment that I spoke about. And they say that regional and global scenario currently lack and would benefit from an explicit consideration of the views, perspectives and rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, their knowledge and their understanding of large regions and ecosystems. And they also, it's very interesting, they say that their perspectives and ideas about their desired future pathways, development pathways, because indigenous people globally don't necessarily see human development in the same way as our consumeristic society sees. So it is also coming from a very important, another very important report, which is a World Bank report which was published a few years ago, which says that currently, when globally speaking, 22% of the world's land surface is under the control and management and governance of the indigenous people and local communities. And 80%, up to 80% of the world's biodiversity actually survives in this 20% of the world. So, and I think this is something that all of us would resonate very well with, because all the biodiversity rich areas are also the areas which are culturally rich, which are Adivasi lands with our local communities with their cultural practices still living. So such areas are globally gaining recognition in the recent times because of the efforts of the indigenous people, who are actually also fighting and trying to increase their voice in the climate debates, saying that you cannot really reverse the climate disaster unless you listen to us and change and transform the way you're living your lives. So these are areas which are called community conserved areas in conventions like CBD. But indigenous people themselves prefer to call them territories of life, because they say there's nothing conservation which is separate from our economy and living. It's our life. So these are territories of life, which is human life as well as all other life. And they have three main characteristics. Quickly going over them, the main characteristics are that these are areas where the main decision makers are the indigenous communities. They have certain rules and traditional systems which are leading to conservation. The conservation may not be the primary objective of such rules and ways of living, but conservation is an outcome. So it's an outcome-based system. Sadly speaking, in countries like India, legally, community conserved areas are still not recognized. We still don't have any law which recognizes community conserved areas. There are a few other laws which provide some space. We will talk about them later. So we see that far from being careless users, which has been at the root of our conservation policies, indigenous peoples and local communities actually not only maintain but enrich local biodiversity, both agrobiodiversity, they promote habitat connectivity and creating new habitats sometimes. And for them, as I said, the areas where they live are not commodity, they are their territories of life. There are still many practices and ceremonies which if we look at them very seriously, and I'm sure many of you actually have worked on it, they are very closely linked to conservation practices. And India, in our country, we have a really long history of conservation by communities as well as by state. We have examples like King Ashok having many hunting reserves and also Abhayaranya areas set aside for wild animals. So if, as Milind had said in the introduction, a few years ago, we started exploring this and we started seeing, do we still have community conserved areas? Do communities necessarily always harm biodiversity? And when we did research, we found that across all communities, Adivasis and non-Adivasis, local communities, pastoralist communities, grassland communities, we have examples of community conservation even today across the country, across ecosystems. Many I'll quickly run through, which could be stretches of rivers which are set aside for indigenous fish, which is increasingly disappearing because of introduction of fish in various water bodies. Or if you would see this picture from Uttarakhand, which is a spirit forest on the high altitude, which protects the water source for rivers down, villages down below. Or there are association with specific species. I think everybody is familiar with Salman Khan and his shooting of the black buck and the Vishnoi community, but there are many other communities also which consider the black buck a sacred species. We have example of many heronaries where migratory birds come and roost. Thanks to the patience, tolerance and acceptance of the local people, they are given a protected environment. We have examples, new initiatives like this one from Rushikulia in Odisha, where young people are now taking up to protect the leatherback turtle, which comes post. Thousands of examples from Odisha and many other parts of Uttarakhand, many other parts of the country of large patches of forest being protected by local villagers because their livelihood depends on it, their cultures depend on it, including by exclusively women communities. We have examples where agricultural diversity is being protected along with protection of forest for a revival of wildlife in villages like Jardhar Gaon in Uttarakhand. And even in states, northeastern states, which are largely known for their hunting traditions and cultures, We have states like Nagaland, which report more than 700 villages which have been declared as wildlife reserves. And I must mention here that the land here, unlike in the rest of the country, is largely under the control of the communities. So they themselves, within their controlled territories, have declared 700 and more protected areas. Nagaland is probably one of the states where they have created a federation of community conserved areas in their state, which is a very interesting phenomenon. But as we would see, because these are not legally recognized spaces, they face a lot of threats and pressures and need support. And largest amount of threat comes from the fact that they have unclear and unrecognized legal status. Even though many, except in states like Nagaland, when they are protecting the spaces, unless if these are their own private lands or village lands, legally they are owned by some state agency, very often by the forest department. There's lack of information about how significant these areas are for biodiversity, conservation, and for a future model. They face threats from development projects, I already said, mining, dams, industrialization, urbanization, pollution, all threaten the roads coming in, destruction of dams being built on rivers which have sacred streams and ponds and inundating them. And of course, because of what's happening outside in our societies, the local people's, local youth aspirations are also changing, and there are not adequate livelihood options locally to match this aspiration. There are also internal community issues and very often party politics, dividing the villages and creating immense problem in these areas. Cultural and aspirational change, which is changing everywhere. So to address this, one law which came about in 2006 after a lot of struggle by indigenous people, Adivasi communities and local communities, called the Forest Rights Act, or the Scheduled Tribes and Other Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act. This was, if we leave aside some previous acts like the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act and others, this was perhaps the first one which acknowledged and had the intention to undo the historic and continuing injustice faced by scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwelling communities. And it had many kinds of rights that it kind of recognizes, and it says that the rights of these communities are already recognized. They only need to be recorded, and I'm not going to talk about it in great detail right now. So the four kinds of rights that it recognizes are individual land and forest rights. You will hear about it later. Community rights over forest resources, community development rights, and management and conservation rights, which is also part of the community rights. For our conversation today, the community rights provided for under the Forest Rights Act become very significant. So for the first time, this law provides the right to manage, protect, and sustainably use community forest resource. And the community forest resource is defined as customary common forest land within the traditional or customary boundary of a village, or seasonal use of landscape in case of pastoralist communities. So if you are a village and you have your forest which was traditionally, customarily yours, even though the British took it over and declared it a reserve forest or some other legal category of forest, or if you are a pastoralist community which moves long distances with their livestock, then you can still claim that as your traditional customary territory and claim rights over it. Forest management, forest protection, and forest sustainable use. Interestingly, it also provides rights to access and protect biodiversity, intellectual property, right, and traditional knowledge. So till now, the details of this are not worked out even in this law, but there are very few laws which actually protect the intellectual knowledge of the local people, and this is one of them. Right to protect their surrounding from external threats. It's very interesting because this law, for the first time, and this has to be taken very seriously, because for the first time it said that before any patch of forest is diverted, before even the processes for diversion begin under the Forest Conservation Act, the consent of the local communities is a must. So basically what the intention of the act is saying is that the first right to say yes or no is that of a local community, is that of that Adivasi Samaj, or is that of that Gram Sabha, or the local people, to say whether we want this project to come here or not. And if they say no, then there is no point going further. Although this is not how things are progressing, but this is the intention of the law. And then for particularly vulnerable tribal groups which don't necessarily identify with a fixed space as their village, but consider a large territory and associate with this large territory for their cultural identity, the Act also provides for the habitat rights. So they can actually claim this entire habitat is as the habitat of this particularly vulnerable tribal group. This law perhaps is one of the few laws, and if you leave aside some amendments that have been made in the Wildlife Protection Act after coming up of the Forest Rights Act, then this meets the international conservation commitments that we are obligated to but are not necessarily fulfilling, which says that establishment, management and monitoring of protected areas should take place with the full and effective participation of and full respect for the rights of indigenous and local communities, consistent with national law and applicable international obligations. This is just one of the many such decisions that Convention on Biological Diversity has towards recognition of the fact that local communities and indigenous people need to be squarely included in decision making regarding conservation. So if we look at the law, the Forest Rights Act, a study carried out in 2017 showed that if we do not dig very deep, just look at the basic figures, basic records, immediately we can actually bring more than 50% of India's current forest area under the control of the local communities, under the management and governance of the Gram Sabhas. But of course, the implementation of the law is exceedingly slow, so it has not happened yet, as you would hear in subsequent talks. So the expectation for conservation from the Forest Rights Act was that this would definitely democratize the forest and protected area governance. For example, why? Because it had a provision which was in the Forest Rights Act. Forest Rights Act provides for the mechanism for the first time to create a system by which we can have coexistence in a protected area, where we can have co-governance in a protected area. So if a community was to claim a patch of area which is their traditional territory, which falls within a larger protected area, then the management and governance of that territory, that CFR, will be with the community, and in collaboration with the larger authority of the protected area, they can devise management and governance strategies for that. So a very interesting provision. Then it also has a provision for critical wildlife habitat. So for any reason, if it appears that presence of people is causing irreversible damage to a species, and it is scientifically proven that this is really a critical habitat, then that area can be declared a critical wildlife habitat. However, it's not necessary that people have to be relocated from those areas. Basically, it has to have no less or least effect on, their presence has to have least effect on the concerned species. Then it also says that in case it is mutually agreed that relocation is necessary, then it must happen after it has been proven that there is an irreversible damage to species and that there is coexistence is absolutely not possible. So it will necessarily lead to decline in the species in that area. And only after relocation can happen, only after all the rights have been recognized, and only after all the facilities have been provided in the alternative space where they are being relocated. And also it was expected that because of the consent clause, which is now also included in the Forest Conservation Act, and because the right that FRA provides to the local communities to protect their cultural and natural heritage, rampant destruction of forests due to forest diversion will stop. But when we carried out a research in 2018 in how this is, the 2017 we carried out a research, a large group of people as part of CFRLA that Milind had earlier spoken about, carried out a research which showed that generally the implementation of the Forest Rights Act is extremely poor, but in protected areas it's even less. So a research that we carried out in 26 out of 800 protected areas showed that either people had almost no information that there was a law like FRA. If they had information and they had filed any claims for their rights, then more than 50%, 54% were pending for years without any process having taken place. Only 8% in some core areas and 16% in buffer areas of these protected areas were recognized rights. And when we looked closely at some of these recognized rights, we found that many of these were individual land rights. And people who had these rights were not even aware that they had these titles. And we realized that this was mainly done by the state agencies to ensure that the process of relocation could take place, because one of the tick mark exercises for relocation process is to say that you have completed the implementation of Forest Rights Act. In some areas, even after recognition of rights, for example, Simlipal Tiger Reserve, where 44 CFRs were recognized, but despite that, relocation is continuing. So 2 villages from the core and 1 from the buffer is currently being relocated. In many areas like Nagarholi National Park in South India, 30 community rights titles were distributed. But even after receiving the rights, communities were told that you can only collect whatever you need from the 2-kilometer radius from around your village. So what was the purpose of the right? Customary right recognition was unclear. So now, if we talk about how far have we actually used it for democratizing conservation, then we find that we didn't find any examples actually, except Biligiri Rangaswamy Temple Tiger Reserve in Karnataka, where 61 podus or padas or hamlets have received their rights, and they in fact came together and planned. They created a tiger conservation plan in 2008. No, in 2012. Sorry. This plan has still not been recognized by the state agencies. Anyway, these rights have been recognized. They faced a lot of problems initially about exercising these rights, but eventually the Forest Department had to give in. But the interesting fact is this is also a tiger reserve which has shown more than doubling of tiger population between 2008 and 2018, which is after recognition of rights, the population of tigers has more than doubled. And this is an interesting fact because we also have other reports which indicate that there is very little correlation, if at all, between presence of villages and their density and tiger population. We can talk about that later on in this discussion. If we look at Simlipal Tiger Reserve, 44 CFRs have been recognized, and this was one tiger reserve where the district administration came forward and actually facilitated a process of management, development of management plans for these villages so that it could be assimilated into the tiger conservation plan. But despite that, I'm not familiar right now what has happened in last year and a half. But we know that the relocation is continuing from this tiger reserve. But despite this very strong, and it is very understood because the potential of the law is so immense to fundamentally change the way the forest and conservation governance happens, that there is a huge resistance in implementing it by actors and players who have been part of an existing system whose interest get majorly threatened. Hello? Okay. So if we now quickly we will look at Despite this limited implementation, despite all the resistance that is being faced, how have local people, where they have gained these rights, how have they used this law? And that perhaps is the most hopeful scenario of this entire conversation, because we will start by a village which is an iconic village, and I think most of you have heard about it, everybody talks about it, and for the longest time it was the sole example which was being spoken in most presentations and conversations when we talked about community conserved areas. So this is Menda Lekha, which was protecting its 18 hectares of forest even much before the Forest Rights Act came about, for 2 or 3 decades before that. But Forest Rights Act, it struggled again to gain recognition, became one of definitely one of the first villages to gain rights over their traditional forests, which they had been conserving. And since then, they have set an example in multiple ways in defining their rules, laws, governance mechanism, forest management, bamboo management patterns. They have been earning livelihood. Almost every person in the village has assured livelihood through their governance and management practices, as well as NREGA, National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, and combining these two. They have also set aside 10% of the area which they say is for wildlife breeding, as wildlife breeding area, we can say. As I said that earlier, while Menda was the only example that one spoke about, although there were many which were struggling to be in that state, after the Forest Rights Act, many villages have achieved what they were struggling to do earlier, to protect their patches, forests, to gain rights over their natural resources. And Panchgaon in Chandrapur, which is in the buffer of Tadoba Tiger Reserve, is another such example. They gained their rights in 2012 over 1,000 hectares of forest. And this village has more than 115 rules and regulations about how to manage, govern, and use their forest. Also ensuring that the benefits that come out of harvesting whatever resources, predominantly bamboo, from their forest are equitably distributed to all, including women. They maintain a register to record the minutes of the meeting, and also when they go for patrolling, what they find in the forest. They have also left about 10 acres as completely untouched and report return of tigers, sighting of tigers in their forest. There are many such examples. I can go on, but unfortunately, shortage of time doesn't allow that. I will quickly go to another in the same Gadchiroli district, another taluka, Korchi taluka, where we are not talking about one village or two villages. Here we are talking about 90 villages, which have come together, which gained their rights, and they have come together. They have formed a federation of these 90 villages, which they call the Mahagram Sabha. And they again have a set of rules and regulations, how individual Gram Sabhas will operate, how they will manage their forest, how they will auction their commercially important forest produce, how they would gain the income from it, how much share should be kept by the Gram Sabha as a collective, for immediate needs of the society, and how individuals will benefit from them, including, as I said, this is probably one of the few examples where the accounts of the women are also maintained separately, and they received direct benefits in their accounts separate from their male counterparts. And 50% of this constitution of the Mahagram Sabha actually is of women. So it's a very interesting example. I must add that this was also one of the taluka, which was one of the first talukas where during COVID, which came forward, Gram Sabhas came forward to provide resources for their citizens when they were struggling due to lockdown and market closure. These are also, in addition to earning the livelihood, they also ensure that in times other than harvesting time, they actually carry out restoration activities in their forest. Sadly, parts of these forests where the rights of the people was not recognized, despite their constant trying, are under iron ore mining exploration, and the communities are resisting it very strongly, saying that even if we are thrown out of this forest, where will our gods go? So one of the leaders depicted here says, "We celebrate and worship what keeps us alive. Temple doesn't, forest does. A mahua tree will keep me alive for 2 years. I will eat, drink, and sell mahua." But they apart from this, actually, they are carrying out a study. The Mahagram Sabha is carrying out a study along with other research organizations, including TISS and many others, and Kalpavriksha, where they are trying to show how a standing, vibrant, rich forest is, economically speaking, also is much more valuable than mining in that area, both for local people and otherwise. It's a very interesting study that they are currently carrying out. Other than that, there are examples from Madhya Pradesh in Baigachak, where communities are using this law by claiming the rights to stop the forest department from commercial plantations, because they say that commercial plantations is something that do not feed us. They don't maintain our community biodiversity, community health. Our food comes from a more diverse forest. And in addition to that, we have many communities across the country who are trying to use the Forest Rights Act to stop the development projects, mines, hydroelectric dams coming into their territories. Not all of them are successful. There are few success stories like Niamgiri in Odisha that some of you may be familiar with, but unfortunately it's a very murky story otherwise, so not all of them have been very successful. These are the scenes, the resistance scenes from Gadchiroli in Surjagarh forest, where iron ore is proposed and being carried out, and villagers are opposing, and many of them are being are currently in jail for opposing the mining there. So quickly coming to the end of this presentation, we see that precisely because, as I said, because of the impacts that this law can have, it's not something very convenient for a number of people. There's also perhaps a very genuine fear, as I said, there is this distrust of the natives, of the local people, changing cultural and economic situations. There is a genuine fear that FRA may lead to complete destruction of biological diversity. And in others, there is a more political will. And because of that, a few people, foresters included, some conservation organizations, although there are a number of conservation organizations that actually support the Forest Rights Act, but there are a handful which have gone to the court against the act, saying that this is a constitutionally invalid law. So the case is being heard in the Supreme Court, almost led to eviction of 1 million people a couple of years ago, till it was stayed after a lot of hue and cry, and you will hear about it later. But most disturbing trend is the fact that all the other laws or amendment to the laws that have happened, which relate to forest or conservation governance, subsequent to the Forest Rights Act, have almost either decided that the Forest Rights Act does not exist, or created like a parallel system. So whether we talk about the National Wildlife Action Plan, instead of talking about using the institutions which have been described in the Forest Rights Act, where local communities have a say, they have rights, instead of that, they suggest joint forest management institution with the forest department, where the local communities neither have rights nor have as much say as owners of the forest they would have. Same is true with the draft Indian Forest Act, which is actually a 1927 Act, Colonial Act, which is being amended, which is absolutely wonderful. It should be amended, but the amendment is worse than the British Act in many ways. Then if we look at the wildlife, the 2006 amendment actually took into account many of the things that Forest Rights Act speaks about, and is a good amendment, but all subsequent amendments are trying to undo or limit the spread or the potential of the Forest Rights Act. So I'm sorry to be ending at the slightly gloomy end, but this is how it seems, it appears right now. And I think unless we change something fundamentally and carry out some transformational activities, it will remain as dismal, because it's not just about local people and their rights, it's also about us and our lifestyles. So I like to end with this quote I really like from one of the Native American leaders, whose name unfortunately I forgot. If some of you remember, please enlighten me, who says, imagine you want to shoot an arrow. The further back you pull the bowstring, the further the arrow flies. The same is true for our own understanding and vision. The further back we look into history, the further we can go, we can see into our future. Thank you very much for listening in. Thank you to TIR for inviting, and also to Mithibai College. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nima. This has been a really enlightening session, but I know the time has been a little short for this presentation and the broad spectrum of issues that was touched. We have very little time for questions, but we will take a couple of questions because we have another lecture after this on politics of displacement. The speaker has already joined us, but we will take a couple of questions and then move on. I can read in the chat box one question by Nagesh Ji. Success stories you explained whether they were not impacted by local politics, if not any special efforts by the local people. Nima, would you like to answer that?
Yes. I think this is a very, very important question. So I would definitely like to respond to this, because local politics is something that really ruins many local efforts, including in some of the areas where we are working. In areas where people have been able to keep away is a very strong leadership, which is not one person, but like a larger elders leadership, which I have seen in Kochi, where I have been more closely associated with trying to understand the initiative. I have seen that they have put tremendous amount of effort in trying to see that their effort doesn't get sucked into party politics. They are very aware of it. Many of them have been ex-sarpanches, so they are also they used to have a sarpanch sangatna before, so they are also aware of what kind of politics goes on. And it does during election times, for a short while, it does go haywire for a bit, but the leadership plays a very, very important role. So what I have seen here is they don't really keep anyone aside. So it's not that if someone has very strong political intentions, they should be kept away from the process. No, they include them in the process. They're all part of the process, but at the same time, the leadership ensures that political interest does not destabilize the effort. So this is one of the few that I have seen very closely, but I think it's that kind of constant vigilance, constant being very critically aware of the pitfalls, and having the wisdom and compassion to be able to handle it, which is the need.
One more question quickly. Rutuja ji has asked, with regard to most laws, what we see is lack of effective implementation. Generally, the authorities who implement these laws lack empathy and sensitivity towards tribal issues. How do you think this can be addressed?
I think in a multiple way. I don't think I really have an answer to that question, but it's a society. I think we generally, as a society, have lack of empathy for the other. There is a big tendency to othering. We are good, our ways of being is good. We see it in us also, and the other doesn't know, and they don't have their way of being is not good. Of course, it has to be a social process. The transformation has to be at the social level when we begin to accept diversity of views and ways of being and respect. But I think, specifically speaking of the bureaucracy, it will help a lot if there was very stringent training programs where many of the bureaucrats were made to live with the communities, like the examples that I showed, be with them not as the superior, but as part of the community, be their part of their effort, understand it. I think that way, when you are a friend, things are different. When we go to a community as a friend, our relationship is different than when we are in a position of power. So that I believe very strongly should be a very strong component of any training of a bureaucrat. Other than, of course, sharing these examples and stories with them as part of their regular training.
Very well said, Dima. There are more comments and questions. Most of it is applauding your speech. But we are really running short on time, so I request everyone that you can post these questions on our email. Your emails are registered with us in the registration form. So we will get back to you. We will connect you to Nimaji and forward your questions to her. We will also share with her consent her email ID with you.
Yes.
One more person has commented whether this presentation can be made available to everyone. Yes, of course, we will share it with all of you. Please follow Tir Foundation's blog, and we will be also uploading the video of this entire lecture on YouTube channel of Tir Foundation. So if anybody has missed it or wants to go back, share the lecture with more people, it will be definitely there for all of you. Thank you again, Nima, for being with us and delivering excellent lecture.